launched in 2003, and that was a war with disastrous consequences. Absolutely. In terms of the Iraqi population. So now I think if the USA start again appealing to hard power and perhaps not to soft power, and the UK, I would say, also is thinking of perhaps preserving its interest in the region by interfering, that might fuel, I think, instability.
Let me bring in Magdi Mohammed Ali again from Cairo. I mean, do you remain optimistic that the kinds of things you demonstrated for are on track? Does that indeed take time? You heard Professor Nye there say, some of your fellow demonstrators say you need time to organise, otherwise there could be people that you don't like taking over in your country.
Well, I'm very optimistic. I feel that we have achieved well above 95% of our demands, and nothing can happen within 24 hours. We need, of course, some time to properly process the democratic structure of the country. I'm very optimistic with the future. We are people who went out to the streets and demanded freedom, demanded liberty, demanded a certain regime to be brought down because of the injustice, because of poverty, because of all the aspects of our lives were deteriorating more and more with each and every passing year. So having broken this wall of fear, having achieved our demands, we can only be optimistic, and the Egyptian people have proven, as well as the Tunisians, as well as all the Arab countries will, I'm sure of that, will prove that we are dealing in a very civilized way when it comes to the demonstrators. We insist on having peaceful demonstrations.
Magdi, let me just bring in Joseph Nye, because we heard earlier in our report that this could be, for the West, a kind of Suez moment, a moment when there are seen to be such vital interests that there will be some interference, even though we've heard from our studio here that would not be acceptable. But do you see that as a possibility, for example, if Saudi Arabia itself were to become destabilized?
I think it would be a mistake to see that. I think that if the Americans repeat the mistake they made with the invasion of Iraq, it'll make things worse rather than better. That would be to create a terrible narrative in terms of soft power. Basically, the solutions here are going to be made in the region, and we can use our efforts to try to avoid or try to, for example, in the case of Egypt, we basically said to the army, don't shoot the demonstrators. We should be trying in that sense to limit the use of hard power. But our soft power narrative for the future is going to be crucial for long-term or dynamic stability.
Do you think we're being too optimistic in some of this or not?
Well, these countries are completely different. You can't compare Egypt with Yemen or Bahrain or whatever. The Suez moment was the invasion of Iraq. It was disastrous.
As was Suez.
I beg your pardon?
As was Suez itself.
It did so. Disastrous for Western interests. It almost destroyed Iraqi society. They had so-called democracy. They still don't have a government to speak of.
We're not going to go down. The Western powers will not go down that road.
Hard power is absolutely out of the question in these circumstances, and soft power is very unlikely to have much effect. We do well to stand back and simply see how events turn out, which will be different in every country. But there's very little we can do, and we shouldn't pretend that we can.
Do you see this spreading further, spreading perhaps to Syria, perhaps to Saudi Arabia, to other countries which have not yet had the kind of demonstrations we've seen in Egypt?
What is interesting is Saudi Arabia. 2 weeks ago, women took the streets and demanded the release of political prisoners. It hasn't been mediatized a lot in the Western press, but there were, things happening there. The spread, in terms of inspiration, it's already spreading. We had massive protests in Jordan, in Yemen, already in Bahrain, in the Gulf region. There is clearly a model which has started, which has been developed in Egypt and Tunisia. And
even though, as you presumably accept Sandra's right, that they're all different countries, even though there may be common grievances, which we've also heard from Cairo tonight. Common grievances, but perhaps different solutions then in different countries.
Common grievances about domestic governance, about dire economic conditions, about the need for political representation across the society. These are common features. There's also an issue in Egypt, and also now we see in Bahrain, is also shaking the unequal distribution within the society. In Bahrain, the specificity is the sectarian dimension, the Shia Sunni, which we have not seen in Egypt, on the contrary.
Well, exactly, and that is presumably very worrying, isn't it?
That's exactly the point. There's a large majority of Shia. If you talk about democracy, you're talking about a Shia government. If you suppress the Shia, which they're doing, then of course they will look to Iran for support. And there are Shia also in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and some in Dubai. So you are moving towards a situation where you exacerbate this very long-running and very deep and bitter division between those two sects.
Just a final word from Professor Nye. One country in the region, but obviously not an Arab country, Iran, is very high up on the State Department's list of potential problems for the future. Well, how do you think the Iranians will handle this?
Well, the Iranians are somewhat hypocritical in having said that the Egyptian events were a proof of the success of the Iranian Muslim revolution or Islamic revolution, and then they go and suppress those who demonstrate against them. I think the Iranians are going to remain in a deep internal tension, though I suspect that the government using the brutality of the Revolutionary Guards will continue to prevail.
All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Now, wherever you are, the economist John Maynard Keynes very famously argued that when the facts changed, he changed his mind. But when the facts stay the same and the government changes its mind, does this look like weakness or perhaps listening to popular sentiment? Political commentators love it, of course, but does the public really care as long as the government gets it right in the end? Well, however you view it, it happened again today when the Environment Secretary, Caroline Spelman, did an abrupt U-turn on plans to sell off the national forests in England.
I am sorry. We got this one wrong, but we have listened to people's concerns. Yeah. I would like to thank colleagues for their support through what has been a very difficult issue. I now want to move forward in step with the public. I hope that the measures that I've announced today, signalling a fresh approach, demonstrate my intention to do the right thing for our forests and our woodlands. Yeah.
Caroline Spelman doing a mea culpa there. Well, our political correspondent Ian Watson is here with more of the sound of screeching tyres and U-turns. First of all, on forestry, how did all that come about?
Yes, well, of course, another female politician said she wasn't for turning, but when Caroline Spelman made her statement today, of course, in this post-Thatcherite era, I think the government simply takes the view that, quite frankly, it's better to do a screeching U-turn than to run out of political road and end up in some kind of Thelma and Louise-type disaster. So what really happened was we knew this policy on the sell-off of England's forests was potentially in trouble yesterday when the Prime Minister himself, when asked by Ed Miliband at Prime Minister's Questions, he said that he wasn't happy with the forestry sell-off. Now, he was under some pressure because there's a massive petition in this, more than 500,000 signatures, but also under pressure from Conservative backbenchers in rural areas. But what perhaps has a little bit less attention than the forest sell-off was another U-turn today with pressure being applied actually from the Liberal Democrat side of the coalition. Now, this was plans, of course, to cut housing benefit levels for unemployed people who'd been unemployed for more than a year, claiming job seekers allowance. That has now been abandoned as well by Ian Duncan Smith. But I wouldn't really like you to get the impression, Gavin, of course, that these U-turns, like buses, all come along at once. In fact, the whole process started last year. The government got into some real trouble, really, over the funding of school sports. There's a thing called the School Sports Partnership in England. Now, there's some pressure applied about plans to abolish this, and suddenly, lo and behold, the government found £47 million to keep that scheme running right up until the summer this year. So, if you like, another screeching U-turn. Some people may disagree, but of course, anticipation is now building on future U-turns. Some people are worried about this. We're likely to see, I think, another reversal this time. I think the reverse gear is in overdrive in this one on prisoners voting. As you know, towards the end of last year, the government said all prisoners serving sentences of 4 years or less will get the vote. So to apply with the European
I'm somewhat
Court.
distracted by the Top Gear graphics going around us.
I'll try and keep these driving analogies going as far as we can.
It's giving me a headache, actually. Now, is there any sign that the government is saying, hold on a minute, we can get away with this, it might be fair to fess up when we do things wrong, but we've got to get a grip?
They are saying we've got to get a grip. Not just the government, of course, the backbenchers are saying this, and this is the kind of paradox here, in a sense. Backbenchers are saying, look, we want to see some of these individual policies changed, but collectively, when they see this kind of narrative of U-turns building up, they're saying now, some of them are saying to me, in fact, the government has lost its political antenna. They're saying that, in fact, that there's a question of competence over some government ministers. They'd like to see some reshuffles going on. Downing Street recognise this as a problem. They're doing at least two things about it. First of all, a new policy unit to try and monitor things from the centre, staffed by civil servants rather than political appointees. And I think quite soon, there's been discussions about this all week, we'll see the pollster Andrew Cooper installed as the new head of strategy. Now, he's obviously got a very keen eye for what plays well with the public, what doesn't. But he has had a background in the SDP, previously worked for William Hague. He's seen as a moderniser, somebody who wants to decontaminate the Conservative brand. So those very same backbenchers are a bit sceptical about him. So in a sense, every solution brings a new problem.
OK, Iain, we're going to leave it there. I'm going to do my own U-turn and be joined by Danny Finkelstein, who now writes for The Times, but was formerly with the Conservative Central Office, and Matthew Taylor, who worked for Tony Blair in Downing Street. Just on the forestry thing,
Yes.
I mean, the politics of that were pretty terrible, weren't they?
Yeah, and it was obvious that the right thing to do was to make a U-turn. And you don't want to make a U-turn on the central elements of your policy. That's where this term came from. Margaret Thatcher wasn't going to make a U-turn back towards incomes policy. But when the policy relates to who is the best person to prune the conifers in the woodlands outside Nottingham, obviously the right thing to do is not to annoy a lot of voters and to back off. And you're never going to avoid having, if you're doing a big programme of cuts for a deficit reduction programme, you're never going to avoid making things like that you have to reverse.
I wonder if the public actually either doesn't care in the sense of, you know, as long as the government gets to the right point in the end in their view, or alternatively thinks actually it's a good thing for politicians to say, we've had a look at it, you're right, we're wrong, we've changed our mind.
It's all a matter of scale. If you occasionally change your mind, it's fine. And in fact, as you say, it can be a good thing. If you seem to be doing it repeatedly, it undermines you, undermines your image of kind of competency. But of course, it means that when you propose something new, people have the hope that if you U-turn before you'll U-turn again. And
honestly, put the pressure on.
Well, exactly. And I mean, the thing about the Forestry Commission, which might come back to harm the coalition, is that if they're doing something that's much more damaging and hurts the vulnerable in society, you get much people saying, well, isn't it interesting? They were willing to U-turn on the forestry because all these middle-class people ganged up on something which wasn't terribly important. But now it comes to something which is affecting the lives of millions of poor people, well, they're much more resolute. So it's not good news.
Has it got to do with also, you made the case that, you know, this is perhaps a minor thing we'll all forget about in a few months, but it's also got to do with the way the government is run, isn't it? I mean, does David Cameron have a real grip on it, or is he kind of relaxed?
I think the problem is they're launching things to solve problems people didn't realise were problems. When it relates to the deficit, people understand the problem, so they're prepared to put up with even quite controversial solutions. The problem comes when, with, say, forestry management, and it may also happen again with the National Health Service, the government hasn't, on a much bigger scale, the government hasn't necessarily explained to people what the problem is they're trying to solve, hasn't made people come along with them. So I think there has been strategic failure in government in terms of trying to explain the problems they're trying to solve before trying to solve them, and that's caused them to startle the public and then have to reverse themselves.
Yeah, I mean, is that the point? If you put it in the manifesto, there's a problem with who owns the forests, and people read it and vote for you or don't vote for you. But this is a bit of a surprise, and people didn't like it.
No, but I think Dan's absolutely right about the fact that what this sheds light on is a kind of strategic failure. Because I think what you've kind of got in government at the moment is that because there's been a lack of corporate leadership, you can think it's in a large organisation at the centre, everyone's been allowed to do what they want. And what happens in an organisation where everyone to do what they want is everyone's got their own initiative, everyone's got their own idea, and suddenly you're overloaded. There's too much going on. You're fighting on too many fronts. And that's why there is a connection between these U-turns and the beefing up of Number 10. And I think that anybody who's watched Number 10's performance over the last few months knew it was only a matter of time before the Prime Minister realised that he had a massively underpowered centre.
Underpowered and going too fast. I mean, he doesn't want to do what Tony Blair did in his first term, which is not to go very fast at all. To go very fast and more haste causes problems like this, unless you've really got it.
And of course you can only U-turn if you're going in a certain direction in the first place. And Tony Blair's problem was that it was years before he decided what he wanted to do, and therefore he didn't make all these U-turns. But I mean, you would expect we're the union of special advisors, I suppose, that we'll come out and say we want more.
A very popular union it is too.
Yeah,
we'll
a union of two members.
Our brilliant solution is more special advisors. But I do actually agree that the government's the opposition's sort of populist response was, we won't need all these political advisors. And I always thought, and I know Matthew did, that was going to be a mistake.
Which, by the way, Gordon Brown said exactly the same thing when he became Prime Minister. I don't need all these special advisors.
Never mind the special pleading for special advisors. But is the NHS, you suggested, could be a big time bomb for the government, because they haven't explained to us what's wrong before they fix it.
I think it could be a political problem, because David Cameron's image as a change Conservative depends very much upon people believing he's different on the NHS. I think that the problem with the NHS is if they leave it and they don't put lots of money in, it's going to go wrong. So they had to do something, but they didn't explain that to people, and people have been startled by that.
Members of the cabinet, they're pretty startled by it.
And they have therefore been startled by it. Now, I think that this is a much bigger proposal, and they're going to have to progress with it. I personally think the policies are actually the right ones, but politically they've got off on the wrong foot.
I think that's true, but can I also make another prediction, which is something that